Setting up a MIDI pedal board is not difficult, but it definitely helps if you have some guidance. In this video, we will focus on the physical aspects of MIDI. That means the MIDI connections that are needed to allow all your pedals to be controlled by a single MIDI controller. By the end of this video, you'll be familiar with MIDI connections and be able to set up a MIDI pedal board of your own. So if you're considering getting into MIDI for your pedal board, you're in the right place. Let's dive right in. To start things off, let's first make it clear that your MIDI signal is completely separate from your audio signal, and one does not affect the other. Therefore, the order in which you connect your pedals via MIDI does not matter. You should just connect them based on how easy it is to link them all together. Let's start with how MIDI flows, beginning at the source, your MIDI controller. Your MIDI controller is the one that generates and sends all the MIDI messages that control your other pedals, and they all get sent from its MIDI out port. In the past, MIDI used to be transmitted only with 5-pin connectors, but that is no longer the case today. Today, many brands are also using stereo headphone type jacks to send and receive MIDI. But for now, let's start with 5-pin MIDI cables, which are still very widely used today, and we'll get back to the other types of MIDI cables later. The first connection you need to make is from your MIDI controller's MIDI out port to the MIDI in port of your first pedal. That's how MIDI flows, from an output to an input. The first pedal you connect should be the pedal that is closest to your MIDI controller. Once they are connected, your MIDI controller will be able to control your first pedal. But what next now? How do you continue to connect the rest of the pedals? That's a great question with a very simple answer. In addition to their MIDI in ports, most MIDI pedals also have MIDI through ports. This allows incoming MIDI to flow through and be passed on down your MIDI signal chain. With this, you can then connect the MIDI through port of your first effect pedal to the MIDI in port of your second pedal. Your MIDI messages will be able to flow from your MIDI controller through the first pedal and reach your second pedal. This daisy chaining can continue on with the rest of your pedals until they are all connected by MIDI. Set each of your pedals to a different MIDI channel so that each pedal will respond only to MIDI messages meant for it. We explained that in our MIDI Basics video here, and also linked it in the description down below. Check it out for a pretty good beginner's introduction to pedalboard MIDI. Now, what if your effects pedal doesn't have a MIDI through port? Some MIDI pedals do not have MIDI through ports and cannot pass MIDI down the chain. But not to worry, because there are a few simple ways you can solve this. If you have only one pedal that does not have MIDI through, the solution is really simple. Just place it last in your MIDI chain so that you will not need to relay any MIDI through it. But if you have more than one MIDI pedal that does not have a MIDI through port, then you will need more MIDI outputs. This is when having a MIDI controller with multiple MIDI outputs is helpful. Morningstar controllers all have multiple MIDI outputs. On the MC3, you've got one 5-pin, 1/4 inch, and 4 3.5mm TRS MIDI outputs. On the MC6, you get one 5-pin and 2/4 inch TRS outputs. And on the MC8, you get one 5-pin output and 4/4 inch TRS outputs. With these extra MIDI outputs, you can connect directly to all your pedals and not worry about running into a dead end due to a lack of MIDI through ports. The 1/4 inch ports on Morningstar controllers are called omniports and can also function as MIDI outputs, expression pedal inputs, or aux switch inputs, so you have a lot of flexibility. If your MIDI controller does not have multiple MIDI outputs, the third and final solution is to use a MIDI box. A MIDI box takes a single MIDI input and splits it into multiple MIDI outputs, allowing you to connect to more pedals with just one MIDI output. These are easily available and generally inexpensive. There are many options available from different companies, including our own version of the MIDI box that features 3.5mm MIDI outputs to give you the most number of outputs while still being one of, if not the smallest MIDI box available. It also has 5-pin MIDI through, so you can continue daisy chaining your MIDI signal. All you need to do is connect the MIDI output of your MIDI controller to the MIDI input of the MIDI box, and you now have more MIDI outputs to connect to as many pedals as you need. If you've enjoyed this video so far, do consider subscribing and also liking this video. It helps our channel grow and allows us to keep putting out content like this for you guys. Thank you. Now let's talk about the different types of MIDI connectors that are commonly used today. There are just two of them. The two types of MIDI ports you will see on devices today are 5-pin ports and TRS stereo headphone type jacks. Just like with headphones, the TRS jacks for MIDI come in two sizes, 1/4 inch and 3.5mm. Other than the size difference, there is no difference between the two. While the 5-pin MIDI connector has been working perfectly, it is bulkier and more expensive compared to headphone type connectors like these. That is why there has recently been a shift towards using TRS headphone jacks for MIDI instead. If you were to Google MIDI cable at this moment, you will still be flooded by images of 5-pin DIN5 cables. However, TRS MIDI connectors have gained a lot of popularity in recent times. Aside from taking up much less space compared to traditional 5-pin ports, TRS cables are also much more easily available and are also usually more affordable. Today, more companies than ever are opting to use TRS jacks for MIDI instead of traditional 5-pin connectors. Some of the notable companies that have adopted TRS MIDI are Boss, Strymon with their smaller format pedals, Chase Bliss Audio, Meris, New Neighbor, and Jackson Audio. TRS stands for tip, ring, and sleeve, which are the three parts of a TRS connector. There are 4 different TRS MIDI configurations: Type A, Type B, tip active, and ring active. I know that can sound a little complex, but all you need to know is that Type A is the MIDI standard, and most MIDI pedals comply with the MIDI standard, while some other pedals receive MIDI via the other configurations. If that is the case, you will need a MIDI controller that can be configured to send MIDI via all the different TRS configurations. All Morningstar controllers can do that, and each TRS MIDI output can be independently configured according to what you need. So rest assured that you'll be able to properly control all TRS MIDI devices regardless of whichever configuration is adopted. Now, if you ever need to connect one MIDI connector type to another type, you can use custom cables or breakout adapter cables like these. These allow you to adapt TRS MIDI jacks to 5-pin and vice versa. These are available on our website as add-ons when you purchase a MIDI controller, but you can also find them online. What if your pedals are not MIDI capable? This could be the case especially for many analog overdrives, distortions, and preamp pedals. Even if some of your pedals don't have MIDI, you can still use MIDI to engage or bypass them, to include or exclude them from each of your MIDI presets. To do this, you will need a MIDI controlled loop switcher like the ML5 or any other loop switcher that can be controlled by MIDI. This will allow you to decide which non-MIDI pedals you want engaged or bypassed in each of your MIDI Pedalboard presets. We explained how a loop switcher works in this video up here and also linked it in the description below. Now, what MIDI cables are best for you? Most decent quality, basic MIDI cables will do the job well. When it comes to which MIDI cable to use, it's more about space saving and whether or not the connector plug obstructs neighboring ports on your device. If you're using a TRS cable for MIDI, it's pretty straightforward. Any stereo cable will do the job, and you have a whole host of options to choose from. Whether you want an angled connector or a low profile plug, the choice is yours. However, when it comes to 5-pin MIDI cables like these, it gets a little trickier. Unlike a headphone jack, a 5-pin plug cannot rotate freely after it has been plugged in. Therefore, the direction in which the cable points is fixed. This is worth noting because having a cable that points in the wrong direction can obstruct neighboring ports that you may need to use, which is definitely not what we want. Some 5-pin cables will allow you to change the direction in which your cable points, which is a handy feature to have. Others are low profile, helping you to save space and pack your pedals closer. These usually come at a slight premium, but if you need the features they offer, it's definitely a worthwhile investment in the long run. We've done some extensive testing on a few of the more popular 5-pin MIDI cables available to help you to make the best decision. We've linked the review in the description down below. In it, we reveal the pros and cons of the various MIDI cables and the little quirks that each might have. So do check it out if you're in the market for MIDI cables. We're also in the midst of designing and prototyping our very own version of the MIDI cable. We think that once these are ready, they'll be one of the best on the market in terms of flexibility and versatility. We're very excited about them and we can't wait to share more about them with you in the near future. Don't forget to like this video and also consider subscribing if you've watched all the way up till here. Also follow us on Instagram and Facebook for all the latest product and feature updates. We'd love to see you there. Now go ahead and have fun building your MIDI pedal board, and I'll catch you again as always in the next video. Peace.